Welcome to Genki Zone. If you have not subscribed to our channel, please subscribe it. Today, we are unraveling the complex, sometimes totally contradictory, and honestly, absolutely fascinating historical threads that shaped America's last frontier.
Oh, for sure, because the history of Alaska, it is anything but a simple, straightforward story of westward expansion. We're talking about the surprising mechanics of the 1867 purchase, a bizarre 1930s New Deal experiment, and the really incredible ongoing evolution of Alaska Native sovereignty. It's a lot, so let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. When we think of the United States buying Alaska from Russia back in 1867 for $7.2 million, it is so easy to picture this grand scene, right? A massive wooden ship loaded up with heavy chests of gold bullion crossing the ocean. But the reality? No ship, no chests. It was handled with a giant piece of paper. The entire transaction was basically executed through a massive U.S. government treasury check.
Right. I mean, in the mid-19th century, the U.S. government literally used the exact same basic procedure for dispersing $7.2 million in gold as they did for buying, like, a $150 wooden desk.
And the mechanics were surprisingly modern. In July of 1867, the U.S. Treasury issued a warrant for the gold. By August, a draft was made payable to Edward de Stucler, the Russian diplomat who actually negotiated the sale. Now, Stuckel didn't go load gold onto a ship. Nope. He just walked into Riggs Bank in Washington, endorsed the draft, and instructed them to wire the money to Russia's foreign account at Baring Brothers over in London. Riggs Bank took a cool $3,600 fee just for doing that. Oh, and get this. Stuckel also authorized Riggs to pay a lobbyist named Robert J. Walker $26,000 in gold for his quote-unquote services in getting the whole deal approved.
It really makes you wonder, if you were handling a multi-million-dollar international transaction all the way back in 1867, would you trust a brand new bank wire, or would you absolutely demand physical gold on a ship?
Seriously, it's a huge risk either way. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to read what you do in that situation.
Now, you might be wondering, why did Russia even sell the territory in the first place? Well, it wasn't just because the sea otter fur trade was declining, though that was part of it. Following their really heavy defeat in the Crimean War, the Russian Empire recognized a critical, glaring vulnerability. They were completely overextended, and their treasury was just exhausted. Plus, they desperately wanted a geopolitical buffer against their great rival, Great Britain, who controlled neighboring Canada. Selling this distant, underpopulated colony to the United States, it just seemed like the perfect way to solve a massive budget crisis while also fostering closer diplomatic ties with America.
Now, what's really interesting about this part of the history is how the Russian presence set a legal precedent that completely scrambled American Indian policy later on. So under the 1844 Russian Charter, Alaska natives were legally divided. Those who lived in settled areas or maybe had mixed heritage were basically treated as Russian subjects. But the independent tribes, the ones living way outside of these specific settlements in the interior or the Arctic, they were entirely left alone. The Russians didn't even try to control them. And here is where it gets incredibly messy for the incoming Americans. The 1867 Treaty of Secession actually codified these old Russian classifications, so it divided Alaska natives into two distinct groups. The quote-unquote civilized inhabitants, meaning the settled groups from the Russian era, well, they were granted the rights of United States citizens. They could contract, sue, sell property, the whole shebang. But the quote-unquote uncivilized tribes, the independent groups, were designated as wards of the state, meaning they were subject to federal Indian laws and regulations, just like tribes down in the lower 48 states. Yeah, and this created a massive decades-long doctrinal confusion. Early American administration in Alaska was completely defined by this totally arbitrary line between what they called civilized and uncivilized tribes. It was a deeply, deeply paternalistic system. The federal government basically just assumed that assimilation into Western settler identity was the only viable path forward. They largely ignored indigenous ways of life and ended up creating immense legal friction over land and sovereignty.
And that friction has a very, very long legacy. So, how do you think these rigid 1867 legal classifications still affect Alaskan communities today?
Yeah, do you think modern laws have fully smoothed out these historical bumps, or are the echoes still there? Drop your answers in the comments below.
Let's move to and see how this spills into the 20th century, because this colonial mindset heavily influenced how the federal government viewed Alaska moving forward. By the 1930s, the feds were still trying to figure out exactly how to quote-unquote settle Alaska. Right in the middle of the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal spawned this incredible social experiment, the Matanuska Valley Colony. In 1935, the government actually relocated 202 struggling farm families from the Midwest, moving them directly to Palmer, Alaska, to artificially create a brand new agricultural frontier.
But here's the catch. These weren't exactly the rugged pioneers of the 1800s. In fact, the 1935 article in the Saturday Evening Post totally mocked them, dubbing them the Red Plush Pioneers. Why? Well, because unlike the pioneers who crossed the plains in dusty covered wagons, these colonists arrived in Alaska on air-conditioned trains and government-chartered steamships. They really didn't rough it. They were 20th century consumers fully expecting a 1930s standard of living.
The level of federal subsidization was just staggering. Handpicked by the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, these families, mostly from Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, were granted 40 to 120-acre tracts of land through a literal lottery system. And it didn't stop at just giving them land. The government provided prefabricated houses, newly constructed barns, and gave them access to massive lines of consumer credit. They were basically expected to build a perfect, rugged frontier utopia overnight.
Unsurprisingly, reality crashed pretty hard into this utopian planning. The government was pushing these families to become subsistence farmers. But, you can't easily do subsistence farming while racking up massive debt for modern consumer goods. Plus, there was a severe lack of basic roads. And the ultimate irony of the whole thing? The government built Alaska Railroad, which was originally supposed to help them export their goods, actually just made it easier to import much cheaper, mass-produced food from the lower 48 states. This effectively ruined the very local agricultural market the colonists were supposedly sent there to build. It was an incredibly stressful, chaotic situation for those families. So think about this. If it were 1935 and you were struggling through the Great Depression, would you have packed up your entire family and moved to Alaska for a subsidized 40-acre farm? Seriously, would the risk of government debt in a frozen frontier be way too much? Sound off in the comments. And this brilliantly illustrates a massive gap between the frontier myth, this romanticized idea of rugged individualism and taming the wild, and the actual Alaskan reality. The reality is that Alaska was, and in many ways, honestly still is, heavily developed as a subsidized colony. Whether we're talking about agriculture, timber, or oil, federal investment and outside corporate interests have almost always driven the framework of settlement. And this exact colonial approach deeply, deeply affected Alaskan Native populations as well. For decades leading up to the 1950s, federal Indian policy in Alaska bounced aggressively between extreme paternalism and forced assimilation. By the 1950s, the government entered what's known as the termination era, actively trying to dismantle tribal identities entirely. But Alaskan Natives fought back fiercely, especially when Alaskan statehood in 1959 threatened to permanently cloud their Aboriginal land claims. Everything changed in 1970. President Richard Nixon ushered in a major policy shift, moving the federal government completely away from those destructive termination policies and moving toward a new era of self-determination. The government finally began to recognize that empowering Native governance, rather than trying to erase it, was the legally and morally correct path forward.
And this momentum led directly to the 1971 Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, commonly known as ANSA. It was a radically unique approach, especially when you compare to the reservation system down in the lower 48. Step 1 was extinguishing Aboriginal land claims so the state could go ahead and develop its oil pipeline. Step 2, instead of creating reservations, they established regional Native corporations to manage nearly $1 billion in cash settlements and millions of acres of land. Don Wright, who was the president of the Alaska Federation of Natives, actively supported this corporate solution to ensure Native groups actually had real economic power.
ANCA remains a heavily debated topic even today. Do you think a corporate structure, actually creating shareholders instead of traditional reservations, was the best way to settle historic land claims?
It is a completely unique model globally. We really want to read your opinions in the comments.
So the crucial point is that out of this incredibly complex web of Russian treaties, New Deal failures, and corporate land settlements, modern Alaska Native sovereignty has emerged stronger. Today, the framework explicitly recognizes inherent tribal sovereignty. There are vital government-to-government relationships between the federal government and Alaska tribes. In fact, tribes now deliver massive statewide services, like rural health care, carefully navigating those complex jurisdictional lines with the state of Alaska.
From a multi-million-dollar check casually cashed in Washington, to the Red Plush Pioneers, to the relentless fight for self-determination, Alaska's history completely defies the standard American textbook narrative. It leaves us with one highly provocative thought to end this explainer on. Did the 1867 purchase truly buy a blank slate new frontier, or did it merely inherit a legacy of deep, legal, and cultural